So to start the ethical analysis, we have two friends and experts on revolutions and insurgencies. And Valerie's going to go first. Dr. Valarie Morkevicius is Associate Professor of Political Science at Colgate University, and she's the author of a recently released book called Realist Ethics, Just War Traditions as Power Politics. And her articles include one called Why We Need a Just Rebellion Theory, and I think some of her remarks will be based on that article. And I should also note that she was a Stockdale Fellow in 2010, 2011, is that right? Yes. So thank you for coming, Valarie. And then following is Dr. Michael Gross, and he'll focus more on the Bello issues, especially regarding insurgencies. Is that correct? And he is the professor of political science at the University of Haifa in Israel, specializing in military ethics and military medical ethics and related questions of national security. And some of his most recent works include The Ethics of Insurgency, 2015, and most recently, Soft War, The Ethics of Unarmed Conflict, which is a really excellent book. I highly recommend it. So thank you both for coming, especially traveling from Israel. And Valarie, to you.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to say a few thank yous. So first of all, to Ed Barrett and the Stockdale Center and all of the wonderful Stockdale Center staff for having us here today, and also for all of you for giving us your time, and that means a lot. I also want to thank the class of 1962, to whom I owed my year when I was here as a research fellow, and also because they supported me in writing my book over the years. So every time I came back, I got a little dose of support and encouragement and a reminder not to give up. So there wouldn't be a book without them. So to frame my remarks today, I want to think about the trade-off between justice and order. And we have a tendency, I think, as Americans, and especially for people who think about just war, to really think a great deal about justice and to underplay the value of order. And so I want to give a kind of personal frame for thinking about this tension and the way in which it can sometimes make us uncomfortable if we think about the situation more realistically and less idealistically. So at the end of World War II, Lithuania was occupied by the Soviet Union, and a partisan movement lasted until after the death of Stalin. Right? And these partisans are treated in Lithuania today as national heroes. And in fact, there's some discussion now about passing a law that would make it illegal to say anything negative about partisans. So I better get this in before that happens. So the gist of it is that partisan warfare, even when fought for very good reasons, right, tends to involve killing civilians. And a particular irony of history is that my husband's grandmother, right, who was a total Lithuanian nationalist, really believed that Lithuania should become independent, was really grateful to have lived long enough to see that. Her parents were killed by partisans. And in the small town cemetery where they're buried, there's a huge memorial to the partisans who, after they died, of old age, right? They're buried there with a gigantic memorial to their career as partisans. And her parents have tiny little graves next to them, right? That don't make any allusion to what happened at all. Right? So in this story, there's a tension between, on the one hand, as a family, we really want to talk about Lithuanian independence because we're of Lithuanian origin and say how wonderful this is and what great heroes these partisans were. But at the same time, those same partisans actually killed people we know, right? People who are part of our family. So I think when we think about the value of fighting for a just cause, right? Even if fighting Stalin and fighting Soviet oppression is a really just cause, oftentimes that's going to go part and parcel with a lot of unjust acts in war, and that might be inevitable, right? That might just be the way that it works in terms of fighting civil wars and revolutions. So with that sort of frame of this tension between justice and order in mind, I want to suggest that we need to think about a realist ethics of rebellion, right? And that's partly because it gives me the opportunity to do this, to plug the book, right? Realist Ethics, which is actually not about rebellion. But most of what I have to say here today are the sections on rebellion that are buried in the book, and I pulled them out to think about this today. And further advertisement, because academics, we've got to make our money somehow, right? I can give you a discount, right, if you want a flyer afterwards. Okay, so what would a realist ethics to just war thinking about rebellion be? I think, first of all, I'm looking at classical sources to do this, so I'm channeling James Turner Johnson. I use these classical sources as a way to get a critical distance from the present, because we're very caught up in the present. So if you think about the Lithuanian partisan case, right, it's too close to the present. We have emotional feelings and thoughts about that. If I had used Syria, right, we would have been already even more dragged into our emotional responses. And if we go back to classical sources, they're talking about conflicts that happened so long ago that we can get that kind of critical distance, and then we can apply those insights to contemporary conflicts, right, with clearer eyes. So I think what comes out for me from these classical sources is the moral value of pragmatism, which sees restraint as a moral, political, and strategic good, right? So it's a strategic good in the sense that fighting in a restrained way can help you win hearts and minds, right? And that very famous phrase. It's a political good in the sense that restrained ends, limited ends, are ends you're more likely to be able to achieve, right? And therefore that's a value. And it's a moral value because having restrained ends means not entering conflicts that have no end, right? And that cause harm to human beings with no end. Furthermore, I think the moral value of pragmatism is that it recognizes the fundamental imperfection of the world we live in and the fundamental limitations of our abilities to actually change it for the better. So thinking as moral pragmatists, we should be highly skeptical about both claims for justice, that we could accomplish a great end, and also skeptical about whether we could actually accomplish said ends, right, even if they were as great as they sounded. And lastly, I think in general we should come away from thinking about classical just war thinking and its moral pragmatism as people who are more skeptical about the claim that we can use force to build good as opposed to simply using force to restrain evil, right? So one is more possible than the other. So what I want to do today is think about what this might look like for a realist ethics of rebellion. And I'm going to emphasize Christian and Islamic approaches to rebellion. And I'm going to pull out what I think is the key concern underlying the way in which both of these traditions think about rebellion, which is their concern with order. So I think there are three claims about order that these two traditions share. One is that order and justice are separate goods, related but separate. Right? So you cannot have justice, any sort of good life, without having an underlying basis of order, right? So this is actually fairly intuitive. But if you imagine living in actual anarchy, right, that would mean when you walk out of here today, you have no idea what will happen to you. Someone could rob you, kill you, right, do horrible things to you, and you have no way of predicting it because there would be total and utter disorder. In such a world, it's impossible to imagine creating just institutions of any kind, just structures, just ways of living. So order is a value because it allows us to create justice, and justice itself can either undermine order. So if you have an unjust system, that system is less stable because of internal contradictions within it. And if you have a great deal of justice in your system, that might actually encourage order. But sometimes they're in tension, right? So you can imagine cases of benign authoritarianism where you might have a great deal of order, but there might at the same time be systemic injustices. Secondly, I think these two traditions share the idea that order is the base of all other goods. You can't pursue justice without it. I've mentioned that already. And third, that order itself serves as a just cause. So the pursuit of order, reestablishing order, can itself be a just cause, even if even if there's not a deeper justice claim to be made. And I draw this from the realization that nearly every iteration of classical just war thinking begins with the premise that wars are fought for the sake of peace, a phrase made most famous by Augustine. This can only make sense if peace in this context is something different than the mere absence of war. Although peace is a good, not every peace is worthy of the name. An unjust peace characterized by instability, persistent threat, or tyranny is no peace, right? But at the same time, the appropriate aim of war is not simply peace, but peace with justice, the establishment of a certain kind of limited just order. Although realists rank the maintenance of order higher than justice, the case for the just war thinker is more nuanced. Traditional and neoclassical just war thinkers in particular value order very highly, as my discussion so far suggests, because I think I'm a neoclassical thinker. Better a bad tyrant than a bad war, we warn. After all, as Vittoria put it, tranquility and peace are counted among the good things which men strive for. Without security, all the other good things together cannot make happiness. But the question of whether order is worth more than justice is always contextual. Just war thinkers imagine that there's such a thing as a just order, an order that prevents human flourishing, and thus, right, they want us to continually be worrying about this tension. The danger, however, that I see for contemporary just war theorists is that we are increasingly inflating the value of justice and the value of order. And this is coming about, I think, because of the revisionist turn and our desire to think about human rights, which causes us to think especially about justice concerns without thinking necessarily about broader communal order concerns. So in order to think about how this plays out in terms of Christian and Islamic traditional approaches to rebellion, I'd like to first think about the Christian tradition, then we'll look at the Islamic tradition. In Christianity, there's two key themes that emerge. One, the problem of authority and whether any rebel organization can claim to have authority to fight against the state's injustice. And two, the recognition that rebellion is a dangerous disorder, so any circumstance which would justify it would have to be a really, really terrible one, right? So first, the problem of authority can be found as far back as Paul's letters to the Romans, where Paul writes, "Let every person be subordinate to the higher authorities. Therefore, whoever resists authority opposes what God has appointed. For rulers are not a cause of fear to good conduct, but to evil. If you do evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword without purpose. It's the servant of God to inflict wrath on the evildoer," right? And then it goes on to mention about paying taxes to whom taxes are due and so forth. So Paul's general argument is that God created the institution of government, what we might today refer to as states, for the purpose of creating social order. And that social order has a value that matters even to people who, in Paul's case, should be concerned about some future, right, in the afterlife. This idea from Paul is carried on into the classical just war tradition, for example, in Aquinas, who says that at times some people are negligent in carrying out the duties which the commonwealth requires. He's speaking here not of the government, but of individual citizens, right, who are not carrying out their duties. So they may even damage the peace of the community when they transgress against justice and disturb the peace of others. So because of this reality that individuals may not always behave themselves in the best way in human communities, he says that we need to create governments, laws, courts, and punishments in order to hold domestic order together. But maintaining order for Aquinas goes beyond punishing common criminals to preventing and suppressing rebellion. The topic of rebellion so concerned Aquinas that he dealt with it in 4 separate works, ranging from the first to the last of his writings. Indeed, during his lifetime, Sicily was affected by several small-scale rebellions, much grumbling over Frederick II's high taxes. One of his brothers was actually executed for his role in a conspiracy against the Holy Roman Emperor. As time goes on, Aquinas' view of rebellion grows bleaker and bleaker. While he acknowledged that tyrannical rule was inherently unjust, he felt that efforts to resist or overthrow tyranny often led to greater injustices. So there's that tension between justice and order. In the Summa Theologia, he argues that tyranny, although it's unjust, can end up that although tyranny is unjust, disruption of such a government therefore does not have the character of sedition, unless perhaps the tyrant's rule is disrupted so inordinately that the community subject to it suffers greater detriment from the ensuing disorder than it did from the tyrannical government itself. In other words, his argument is, yes, tyranny is bad, but, right, only if the tyranny is so bad that the disorder you would create by rebellion would be better than the disorderly life under tyranny should you fight. Right? So that's a pretty high bar for what you might want to consider rebelling against. If the leader in question were not a tyrant, then sedition is a mortal sin because it's contrary to the common good of the community. Martin Luther has the same idea, and it's made even more passionate in Luther's case because of the peasant rebellions that are going on around him, and which indirectly he's part of the necessary causes of. He makes the argument that everything in the world would be ruined if rulers did not use force to maintain order. War for him is only a very brief lack of peace that prevents an everlasting and immeasurable lack of peace. States for him are necessary due to the fallen nature of humanity. There's few who believe, Luther writes, and even fewer who behave like Christians and refrain from doing evil themselves, let alone not resisting evil done to them. Thus, God establishes government and gives it the sword to hold wantonness in check, lest violence and other sins proceed without limit. At the very least, he writes, government serves to create outward peace and prevent evil doing. So in Luther's view, as for Hobbes, man is a wicked, fierce animal who has to be chained and bound so that it cannot bite or tear as its nature would prompt it to do. So earthly law for him is the only thing that stands between humans, right, and this sort of Hobbesian world of beast eating beast. For this reason, he writes, rebellion is the worst disaster. Like a great fire, it attacks and devastates a whole land. It makes widows and orphans. It turns everything upside down. Ultimately, he concludes that a wicked tyrant is more tolerable than a bad war, right? Echoing Aquinas. His view of rebellion reflects the insecurity and disorder of his times, and we can pick out a little bit about his ideas of just authority by thinking about his response to the peasant rebellion. So when Protestant peasants began complaining about the taxes they were having to pay to maintain the Catholic Church, Luther wrote to their princes to advocate for their cause. He thought that the future rebels, the peasants, had a really good justice claim. But when the peasants took matters into their own hands and took up arms against their princes, Luther promptly publishes a series of letters condemning them for having actually rebelled, right? So he thought they had a just cause, but he thought they shouldn't have actually rebelled because they lacked authority, right? Since they were not the government, they had no right to rebel. Although, however, it's worth noting, he thought they had a right to self-defense. So in cases where peasants didn't take matters into their own hands, but rather repelled force that was used against them, he thought that was legitimate, because you don't need a special dispensation of authority in order to protect yourself, right? You only need that to fight wars. Calvin shared the view with Paul and Aquinas and Luther that states reflect a design concerned with order. He argued that magistrates have a commission from God, that they're invested with divine authority, and in fact represent the person of God as whose substitutes they in a manner act. For him, however, government was established not only due to human perverseness in his terms, but also because God saw government as a way of accomplishing actual justice on earth. That makes him different from Luther and Aquinas, who saw government really as only restraining evil, not actually as a positive force for good. So for him, princes had an obligation to uphold order. Consequently, it was permissible and necessary for kings and states to take up arms in order to execute public vengeance, and princes had a public duty to maintain the tranquility of their subjects, to repress the seditious movements of the turbulent, and to assist those who are violently oppressed. And it's in this latter we can see how this difference in Calvin's view that suggests that government can actually serve a positive justice claim leads to a slight difference in his interpretation of rebellion. So for him, he also didn't believe that individuals could have the right to gather together to rebel against a state. But he thought that the leaders of other states might have an obligation to intervene when the citizens of another state were being unjustly oppressed. Right? So you don't have a right to rebel, but you might have the right to ask another state, another magistrate, to come in on your behalf. And so he argues that while subjects don't have the right to try to curb the injustices of their rulers, God can, through the actions of what he calls manifest avengers, punish the accursed tyranny and deliver people from calamity when they're unjustly oppressed. Sometimes in Calvin's views, these leaders are lesser magistrates from the troubled state itself. At other times, God employs the fury of men who have other thoughts and other aims, namely outside princes. And interestingly, he does not think this is actually a deliberate humanitarian intervention all of the time. Because of his view about how God uses human history, he has the idea that positive human good could come out of the sort of rapacious instincts of other kings, right? That sometimes when injustice is happening, God might command, right, a really bad king, actually, in his own state, to go unseat another bad king, right, and liberate the people. So it's a kind of interesting view of the role of the divine in human history. Ultimately, Calvin's approach forecloses populist revolutions, but implies that an elite-led revolt could be permissible and possibly requisite against tyrannical kings, and opens up for us in the contemporary period the idea that humanitarian intervention or responses to rebellion might actually be morally legitimate. But what's not here in this Christian discussion is the idea of what the in bello limits on fighting in a rebellion might be, or a very specific discussion of how political reconciliation could be achieved in cases in which we've reached the point where people are asking themselves, can I rebel, right? So there's a discussion about, can you rebel? No, pretty much the answer is you shouldn't, right? But what do we do with that, right? How do we get out of that political conundrum? And here I think the Islamic approach is actually quite instructive, because it shares with the Christian approach a concern with unity and order, and therefore a disdain for the idea of rebellion. but it spends a great deal more time thinking about what just fighting in a rebellion might look like. So it has a practical approach, right? Although rebellion may not be ideal, it may happen anyway. And it also takes seriously the question of how you might create reconciliation after the war. So in the interest of time, I'm going to highlight maybe just two particular thinkers. So the first is Malik ibn Anas, who lived from 715 to 796 of the Common Era. And he shared the concern of the Abbasid Empire in which he lived with the unity of the Islamic community, an idea that can be tied back to the Quran, that the ideal system would be one, right, in which all Muslims shared the same community. So factions, he argues, can't be tolerated, whether religious or political. He refers to a hadith, for example, that declares that there's no good in departing from the obedience to the emir and from the united body of the Muslims. One must simply hold firm to the united body, right? So you just shouldn't allow your political differences to lead to this kind of disunity. However, because the unity of the community is the primary goal, Malik counsels that rebels ought to be given a fair adjudication before either side resists to force. So here's this idea that, you know, it would have been different in Luther's time, for example, if the peasants had been actually allowed to explain their concerns, right, with an adjudicator, maybe a third-party arbitrator between them and the princes, could that rebellion have been avoided, right? In Malik's view, that conversation, that political conversation, is essential. His argument suggests not only a simple airing of rebels' concerns, but a willingness to really hear them out. Even if the community judges that the rebels that are in the wrong, rather than the mainstream of the community, the rebels should be given the chance to repent. If they're willing to rejoin the community, they shouldn't be fought. This distinguishes them from apostates, who he argues can be executed as soon as their apostasy is revealed. In other words, so long as the conflict remains political and non-violent, the rebels should merely be, as he puts it, arrested, imprisoned, beaten, boycotted, and socially ostracized, right, until they repent, right? But that's short of actually fighting a civil war against them. However, if rebels themselves initiate the use of force, they forfeit the protection normally accorded to them as Muslims, because they make, as he puts it, their own blood permissible by advancing against the people with the sword. So the reference here is to the idea that Muslims should never kill other Muslims, right? And therefore, if that happens by accident or on purpose, blood money is owed. So Malik's argument is that if rebels rise up against their fellow Muslims with force, then it's not illegitimate to fight against them, even though they're your co-religionists. Furthermore, he says, right, when rebels turn to violence, they by default attack the other unjustly, so they must be fought until they revert to Allah's command. Nonetheless, such political rebels retained certain rights in Bello. They were entitled to regain their full status as members of the Muslim community after the conflict ends. Their property had to be returned to them after the cessation of hostilities, and they're to be absolved of having shed the blood of their fellow Muslims, which is actually the thing that warranted using force against them, right? So here's the idea of a reconciliation process after war, right? The end goal of putting down a rebellion, in Malik's view, therefore, isn't victory, but the restoration of a social order and social unity. Likewise, in the works of al-Shafi, who lived from 767 to 820, so just a little bit later, we see the first development of a systemic exposition of the law of rebellion in Islam. Considering the fraught political conditions of his time and the general classical Islamic preference for domestic order and unity, it's not surprising that al-Shafi discussed the legitimacy of rebellion in rather roundabout terms that could be seen as legitimizing the current caliph's reign rather than permitting rebellion more broadly. Right? Al-Shafi, after all, believed, quote, it was legitimate to fight alongside and pray behind anyone who proclaimed himself caliph after attaining a military victory and gaining the backing of the populace. Right? This is a very pragmatic approach. It's a judgment in the favor of order. It's good enough governance, to borrow from Professor Krasner, right? If you can win, then you're good enough, right? And you're establishing order, so we'll follow you, right? If the established authorities, however, are unable to maintain order, then successful newcomers may be permitted to do so. Although al-Shafi never specifically describes what constitutes a just ruler, his definition of a rebel as one who refuses to obey the just order and intends to rebel by fighting him opens up the possibility that resisting an unjust ruler may not be rebellion at all and may in fact be justified. Given the novelty of this move, it's telling that al-Shafi's writing on rebellion dates to after his move to Egypt. So he moves away from the center of power. He's kind of in exile in Egypt, and that's where he has the freedom to sort of play with ideas of rebellion. In later centuries, he'll be singled out for criticism by Ibn Taymiyyah, among others, who accuse him of opening the door for rebellion and civil discord and encouraging chaos and anarchy, which probably goes a little bit too far in terms of what al-Shafi is actually doing. If opening the door ever so slightly to justified rebellion is radical, al-Shafi's understanding of why it's permissible to fight against rebels was entirely politically conservative. Although it's not proper to claim that a rebel's blood may be spilled without exception, al-Shafi wrote, until order is reestablished, we may fight him either to protect ourselves or to ensure compliance with what is demanded of him. The community itself is at stake. For this reason, the entire rebel faction is threatening the health of the community. The community is supposed to be in agreement, and when it's not, the proper response is to first seek reconciliation, as it was for his predecessor Malik. This logic is reflected in al-Shafi's in Bello Counterinsurgency Rules. Rebels must be warned, debated, and given a chance to repent before being fought. Rebels can be fought only as long as they use arms against the state. So if they simply withdraw to another part of the country and continue paying their taxes but don't follow any other laws and don't fight against the state, you have to leave them be, right? Sort of de facto secession. If they cease fighting, their blood again becomes inviolable and you can't punish them for what they had done during the war. Indiscriminate weapons such as mangonels and flamethrowers can't be used against rebels except in dire necessity, when the rebels use these weapons first, or if the rebels occupy a fortress where it would be impossible to defeat them otherwise. And again, rebel property can't be taken as booty. The goods that are confiscated during battle for the sake of fighting have to be returned afterwards. In other words, the weapons that you took from them on the battlefield you have to give back when the conflict is over, which flies in the face of a lot of our post-war reconciliation ideas today. And all captives also have to be liberated at the end. Taken all together, these rules suggest that the rebel must be fought not as a legal imperative, but rather as a necessary evil, where the necessity of maintaining order and stability outweighs the unavoidable costs in terms of Muslim lives. So, right, what are the takeaways from all of this discussion? I think it suggests that there are responsibilities from a contemporary point of view for rebels, states, and interveners. For rebels and the states fighting against them, both have to think not only about just cause, is their side right, is justice on their side, but also about whether they can justly claim authority. And in both traditions, we see a very tiny window of possibility for just authority for rebels, right? And the benefit of the doubt goes to states. But I think it suggests, right, that states may need to sometimes recognize themselves if they've actually forfeited their authority, which realistically speaking is not something they're likely to do. There's also a concern here, I think, with proportionality of the ad bellum sort. Because political order is so valuable in the views of all of these classical theorists, even if you have a just claim that the world could be a better place if the government were different, the world would have to be a lot better, and you have to be really sure you can actually win before you can legitimize fighting from the classical point of view. Which gets us to the point of likelihood of success. I think these classical just war thinkers would really encourage rebels and also states fighting rebellions to think carefully about whether they can actually win. Because if they can't win, they might do more harm than good in resisting if they're the state and in fighting against the state if they're rebels, because of the value of social order. I think the other takeaway is the idea that there are means of fighting that leave the possibility of reconciliation open, and there are ways of fighting that don't. And given the amount of civilian victimization that tends to happen in civil wars, I think this is an important point to consider. Lastly, I think there's a takeaway for states that are likely to be interveners in such conflicts. I think it suggests that they need to think more about just cause, not only about just cause, but also about the value of order. So we have a tendency in the West to really look very highly on rebellions that sound like they're democratic, or sound like they're liberal, or sound like they're in favor of values that we support. And that comes out of the Enlightenment tradition, and it's completely natural. But I think we also have to think about the value of order, even as we embrace other people's desires to accomplish human rights and democracy for themselves. We have to think about whether that's a realistic outcome of the conflicts that they might be initiating. And if it's not a realistic outcome, right, then we might wish to discourage the violent use of force to try to accomplish such ends, as laudable as they might be. I think it also suggests for interveners that if they do intervene, they should have limited war aims that are designed more for reestablishing an order that might be better than the original order, but perhaps less ideal than where any of the rebel groups might want it to be, a good enough order. And finally, I think it suggests that interveners need to have a realistic plan for use post-bellum reconciliation before becoming involved. They need to have a good idea of what that order would look like and how they will fight in a way that will make that order possible, and how they will establish that order once they have control over the territory concerned. So with all this in mind, I'm going to hand it over to Michael Gross. Thank you.
Thank you very much and good morning. It's a great pleasure to be back here again. It's always a pleasure to leave the chaos of the Middle East with the serenity of this country, and I'm enjoying every moment of it. I'm going to pick up a little bit on some of Valarie's remarks. When Ed set up this panel, he asked us to talk about concepts of jus ad bellum and jus in bello in the context of rebellion, insurgency, and interstate war. And as most of you know, most of the time, very often, when we discuss these concepts, we discuss them separately. Jus ad bellum is one set of principles that Valerie mentioned, those of just cause, those of legitimate authority, those of proportionality, those of preserving order. And then jus in bello are those concepts that regulate the conduct of war, issues like the protection of civilian, distinction, non-combatant immunity, and those sorts of principles that we use to regulate the conduct of war. And very often they're not discussed together, they're discussed separately for reasons that I will discuss in a moment. And I think Ed was very clever here when he organized this panel, because he put us together, forcing us to think about how these two concepts might work together in the concept of rebellion. Valarie discussed some of the classical sources. I'm going to discuss some of the more modern sources and some of the more modern conflicts. I'd like to focus on three puzzles or three questions. The first one is, what becomes of the independence thesis in insurgency ethics? The independence thesis, as some of you probably know, is the idea that jus ad bellum and jus in bello are separate. That what concerns international law is how countries fight, how their soldiers fight, and not so much why they went to war, or whether their cause was just, whether their authority was legitimate or not. And the purpose of that is to regulate as closely as possible the conduct of war in order to mitigate the suffering of war. But I'm going to suggest that insurgencies, rebellions, and revolutions present hard problems for this idea, because as you heard from Valarie in the classical sources, as I'm going to say, describe in the contemporary sources, they come together. You cannot talk about the just conduct of a rebellion or an insurgency without understanding its underlying causes. The second question is, are insurgents terrorists or freedom fighters? It's an old question. The answer I'm going to suggest is they're both. And the third question is, who cares about this? Who cares about insurgency ethics? State actors will come along and say, well, the other side doesn't really care. We can talk about the ethics of insurgency. We can talk about in bello, how they should fight, but they're not going to pay attention anyway. And if they don't care, then why should we care? So those questions about why it's important, I think, resonate, as they probably did in classical times. They also resonate today. The independence thesis, as I mentioned earlier, creates a very stark barrier, a very bright line between jus ad bellum on the top of this graphic and jus in bello on the bottom of the graphic. So that when we consider states going to war, we generally don't, for the purposes of law, and very often for the purposes of military ethics, don't consider things like just cause. We only look at the way that they conduct themselves during their fight. And the following graphic is one that many of you as instructors probably use in one form or another, and that is the question of which are insurgents. These two graphics, top graphic depicts a German soldier in 1939 invading Poland. The second, Polish defender shooting against or fighting against, defending himself against the German invasion in 1939. And we accord these individuals, these two soldiers, equality. We can call them enemy comrades in arms for all intents and purposes, because each enjoys the right of self-defense. It's a little bit counterintuitive, perhaps, but we grant the same rights to each. Each is defending their country, each is obeying orders, each is doing their duty, and it doesn't matter for this purpose whether the German soldier is an aggressor, in fact, and the Polish soldier is a defender, in fact. We grant them complete equality. The bank robber graphic is the one that is supposed to depict criminal activity. So a bank robber may use force against a security guard, but he certainly, as in the second graphic, doesn't have any right of self-defense when the security guard tries to prevent him from robbing the bank. So these are the kind of two graphics we use. The bottom one is a little bit outdated. Banks are not robbed Bonnie and Clyde style anymore. They're robbed by cyber techniques, which creates all kinds of interesting questions about self-defense. But in the classical model, we impute to the first group war rights, and that's why it's important. So either one falling prisoner will be granted the status of prisoner of war. We prohibit certain kinds of certain methods of fighting. For example, perfidy is prohibited in the first case, so that this is a war, this is a rule-regulated enterprise between two morally equal agents who are acting as agents of their own state. In the second, they're simply criminals, so that if they're captured, they're tried, they're incarcerated. If they happen to be rebels, they're sometimes executed, and they enjoy no right of repatriation when the conflict ends. And in some cases, we could even think that the criminalization carries on in all these sorts of cases. So the question I want to ask, where do we put insurgents? Are insurgents like Germans and Poles fighting in World War II? Or are insurgents like criminals? Well, for the most part, they're criminals. At least I think that's what I took away from part of what Valarie spoke about, that in the classical just war theory, they're maybe necessary evils. We have to deal with them and somehow, but they are certainly criminals. And I think that's the way many of us look at organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, Taliban, and all these various kinds of groups. We generally tend to criminalize them. But when we look for answers to these questions, and we depart from the classical sources that Bello described, and we try to understand how we answer this question in modern times, I think it's very interesting that one of the first sources where this puzzle is taken up is in the American Civil War. And we heard earlier some comments about the American Civil War. I think we're going to hear them, I hope we're going to hear them perhaps during the day and tomorrow. But in the course of the American Civil War, in the middle of the war, Lincoln, of course, commissioned the Lieber Code. And this was astonishing because the idea of the Lieber Code was to produce a body of law to regulate armed conflict in a rebellion. So it's really odd, and I think exceptionally interesting, that the genesis of the contemporary law of armed conflict arose in the context of a rebellion where it should have been clear. There is no law war for rebels. We should just treat them as criminals and keep the war as quickly as we can and try them all. But it was the genius, of course, of Lincoln to see the war in much different terms, at least in terms of the outcome of the war. And when Lieber took this on, he had to deal with both instituting the law of war and recognizing the fact that he was fighting not another state, as in the upper part of the graphic, but a rebellion. And what Lieber did was to pursue the independence thesis. He writes that adopting, and he was clear about this, he would adopt a program or a code of war, but he was clear that adopting the rules of regular war toward rebels does not imply acknowledgement of their government as a sovereign power. So in other words, he's taking the entire issue of authority, what Valarie said was the criteria of just authority, and probably just cause, because the cause of the South was morally odious to Lincoln and to others. And he's bracketing this. So we're not going to think about this. We're going to put aside the fact they don't have legitimate authority. We're going to put aside the fact that they're not pursuing just cause. Speaking to order, we're going to put aside the fact that they're tearing apart the Union. And we're going to regulate this war and grant them war rights, prisoner of war rights. Lieber has stipulations about perfidy, about assassination that he expected the North to abide by. And I think that they largely did. And then they expected reciprocity, which they largely received. So Lieber brackets this and he sets it aside. But if you jump to the end of the Lieber Code, he emphasizes the government's right to try rebel leaders, right, for high treason, unless included in a general amnesty. So you already see where Lincoln's going with this. And there, of course, was a general amnesty, and no high-ranking leader of the South was ever tried. I think Jefferson Davis was incarcerated for 2 years and finally let free. So this generous sentiment, which, again, oddly enough, arose in the context of the American Civil War, to treat insurgents as what I called earlier enemy comrades in arms, is a magnanimous sentiment, but it seems to have disappeared. It also seems rather counterintuitive, might just be a special case of the American Civil War. And it disappears, and it becomes, the norm becomes then one of treating insurgents as criminals. And this resonated in the 19th century, 20th century, and especially in post-World War II colonial warfare. None of the colonial powers fighting wars in Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, approached anything like this kind of mindset to treat insurgents, rebels, and revolutionaries as some sort of enemy comrade in arms and accorded them war rights. But in 1977, with the Additional Protocol 1, we see that this mindset is beginning to change. We're already beginning to see the post-colonial, well, post-war, the end of the colonial warfare era by the mid-1970s, and we're seeing the international community, particularly the non-aligned nations, asserting themselves. And Additional Protocol 1 reintroduces these ideas of use ad bellum as a necessary condition of fighting well, of being able to gain combatant status within the international community. Because in Protocol 1, there's a special provision there in international, what we're called international armed conflicts, to give war rights to guerrillas fighting against colonial, alien, and racist regimes. This included Palestinians, it included the African National Congress, it included the rebels in Africa, Mozambique, fighting against the Portuguese, and other groups that were fighting against state powers. They're suddenly accorded status as combatants under international law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law. And in fact, during these deliberations in the early 1970s, representatives of some of these groups actually participated in the deliberations about the formulation of Additional Protocol 1 and Additional Protocol 2. So they're gaining a status here. So the argument now is that jus ad bellum is indistinguishable, or not indistinguishable, but a necessary condition of jus in bello. We can't talk about a group fighting well unless we first vetted them, unless they first qualified because they have just cause, because they have some sort of legitimate authority. That was not as addressed as clearly as the idea of just cause. They were fighting against tyranny, against racism, they were fighting for human rights, and therefore they were accorded a level of status that would accord them war rights. Now, what do we do with contemporary insurgents and revolutionaries? What do we do with groups like Hamas? What do we do with groups like the Hezbollah? Do they fit or don't they fit? And those become the very hard questions that we want to ask. But this development, first from a theory that strengthened the independence thesis and then weakened the independence thesis, has, to my mind, a certain moral and practical appeal. Morally, it does seem important that those groups, any group that a state is fighting, first has to satisfy just cause, legitimate authority, proportionality, last resort. Perhaps they have last resort in the sense that they've exhausted other means to achieve their cause. When they take on the mission of mounting rebellion and pursuing what they feel is the advancement of their own rights, generally framed in terms of self-determination. So we have these groups, and first we want to ask whether they fulfill these various arguments, and then we can ask, do they fight well? So there's this idea of according rebels, insurgents, the right to fight. And they earn the right to fight when they have just cause, when they command legitimate authority. Then, of course, the second part of the puzzle is they have to fulfill certain in bello requirements about how they fight. But these two are married together, so if they don't fulfill the first set of requirements, we then generally regard them as criminals. If they do fulfill the first set of requirements, then we treat them like ordinary combatants. and we accord them combatant status as long as they don't violate international law and commit criminal offenses. So practically, this is, I think, very important because as the military historian Martin von Preble said, these principles offer us the ability to know who to honor and who to hang, who we can fight by the rules of war, or who we should fight by the rules of war, and who we need not fight necessarily by the rules of war, but fight by the rules of or human rights law or international criminal law. It's also important for practical reasons because in the field, not only governments, when they go to war, have to know and evaluate these ideas of just cause and legitimate authority when they go to war, but in the field we also see it. So for example, in Israel, the popular conception is that groups like Hamas, groups like Hezbollah fall into the second category. They're criminals. They're fought by criminal law. They're fought, or they're treated by criminal law, so if they're captured, they're not treated as prisoners of war. They're tried, they're sent to jail. Israel has no death penalty, but there are countries that do have death penalties, would certainly be within their rights to even execute these sorts of rebels. But on the other hand, if war were to break out tomorrow in Syria, and Israeli troops were sent to Syria, they're being told a different story. The Syrians, well, they're up here. Why are they up here? Someone might reasonably ask. They're probably greater supporters of a criminal and terrorist regime than those down here. Why are they suddenly, those soldiers suddenly accorded war rights, why members of Hamas and Hezbollah are not accorded war rights? So there's a confusion we see when we talk to our students. They say, it doesn't quite make sense. If they're supporting a terrorist and a criminal regime, why should they be afforded rights under the laws of war? And why should we have to conduct ourselves according to certain laws of war? Perfidy, for example, that I mentioned earlier. But here, those are perfectly acceptable standards. So we need to sort this out. We need to sort it out both at the level of policy making, deciding when to go to war, and we need to sort it out both at the level of the actual conduct of war, about how we're going to conduct ourselves on the battlefield. So I think that insurgencies are very instructive for both theorists and for practitioners. Theorists, many theorists in the just war philosophy community are wrestling with this relationship between jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Should they be tied together? Shouldn't they be tied together? Can we actually make a determination of who has just cause? Because the argument has always been by the ICRC is that we don't want to get into that. We want to be able to treat those on the battlefield humanely without criminalizing some or not criminalizing others. So this whole issue of jus ad bellum doesn't interest us. So there's practical reasons for preserving this distinction. But in insurgency warfare, we do it all the time. We make this call all the time in practice. The international community made it when it drafted Protocol 1 regarding certain groups that they did grant status to, put them on the upper category. Other groups fell into the lower category, which changed the conduct of warfare. We see it in terms of humanitarian intervention. The decision has to be made. So the international community supported insurgents in East Timor against Indonesia. The international community supported South Sudan in its fight against Sudan. And these were determinations that are made on the basis of jus ad bellum. Once that determination is made, then the in bello questions, the right to fight and how they fight, kick in. The United States changed its view of the Taliban just a couple of years ago. First, they were considered unlawful combatants. Then they shifted and became lawful combatants. This was done for pragmatic reasons, for prisoner exchanges, and to maybe search for an end to the conflict. But sometimes these determinations are arbitrary, but they're important. So once the United States reclassifies Taliban as a legitimate or lawful combatant instead of an unlawful combatant, then the way it wages war and the way it treats captured Taliban is going to change. So we learn a lot about how to fight states and non-states with this, but there's still this resonant idea that everybody belongs over here. And I hear it in Israel all the time. All these groups are terrorists. All these groups are criminals. We heard about ISIS. We heard about other groups. And I want to present one other slide that kind of looks at this question of terrorism and asks the question, who are terrorists and who are freedom fighters? And I'm trying here to show you how the landscape of guerrilla groups and insurgency groups is vastly different with regard to civilian military casualties. Don't look too closely at these numbers because they're not going to bear close scrutiny. And that's because there's not a clear definition here of what's civilian and what's military. Some of these take a time slice, and they don't all include what we call internal victims of terrorism. In other words, collaborators and dissidents who were killed, who might have been civilians. Some groups count them, some groups don't. But the point I want to make here is the orange bar, East Timor and Eritrea, these are insurgencies from the 1990s. We see very little of what we call terrorism in the sense of civilians being killed. In these two conflicts, virtually all the casualties were military on the state side. If we go to the other end, we look at the Palestinians, the IRA, who else do I have? The Taliban, the PKK, Hezbollah, Chechnya, and Eritrea, we see a decline, and I arranged them specifically in this way. So some groups, let's start there. All groups use terrorism of some sort. It's a tactic that they use. But they use it to various degrees in conjunction with other tactics. Some groups are mostly direct their military activities against the military, and other groups have high rates of terrorism. So when we talk about freedom fighters or terrorists, there's two or three groups, those on the right, that we can exclude in general from the concept of terrorism, maybe put them in the concept of freedom fighters. Whereas those on the left, we're still thinking terrorism, and now the question becomes, what do we do with this sort of terrorism? Is it justified? Can it be justified? Can it be interpreted in a way? And there's a lot of literature about what we call the justification of terrorism. Some of these civilian casualties might be collateral harm. Some of them might be targets that are in some sense seen as liable for the injustice that the guerrilla group is fighting against. What does that mean, liable? Let's look at it from the state side. In 2006, when Israel fought against Hezbollah, they fought a 36-day war. By day 3 of the war, all the military targets were exhausted. There was nothing left for Israel to bomb from the air. These were missile launchers, these were arms depot, and supply areas. So what do? How do you prosecute a war when there are no military targets? This was a problem that plagued the United States at the same time, and later on in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the attention turns to what some have called associated targets. These are targets associated with a guerrilla organization that include those that are generally part of the political wing of a guerrilla organization. Financial, telecommunications, recruitment, sometimes religion, religious groups, schools. They're generally infrastructures, but the people who work in infrastructures are civilians. So they're civilian objects. They're not necessarily dual-use objects, but they're civilian objects they're objects that are staffed by civilian members that serve the interests and the workings of a guerrilla organization. These become the targets of choice, and these are the ones that were prosecuted by Israel in 2006 towards the end of the war and have become part of U.S. Targeting policy in Iraq and Afghanistan. If we flip the coin and say, well, if states can do that, then what about non-states? What about guerrillas as they fight? Can they think about certain civilian targets, infrastructural targets, or those targets that are liable that might be legitimate targets? So this discussion has come up, and what we see in insurgency ethics is a kind of expansion a little bit of the principle of non-combatant immunity. We're lowering the bar a little bit. We're lowering the bar to include civilians who in conventional warfare who are not necessarily targetable. Those of us who teach it very often show the movie The Battle of Algiers, Pontecorvo's film. And there you see how at one point in the Algerian insurgency against the French, they're very careful to target police, colonial administration, and these kinds of some are quasi-military like the police, others are clearly civilian populations. They become targetable both in the minds of insurgents and counterinsurgents because they bear some element of liability. And then there's the use of non-lethal weapons against civilian targets. We're doing more and more work with this in the last few years. Cyber attacks against civilian objects because they don't cause harm. Economic boycotts, and these run both ways. both states and non-states can undertake cyber warfare. They can undertake economic warfare, although on different scales. We sometimes see in insurgency warfare what we call terrorism, where sometimes a tourist site is threatened, and it's sufficient to threaten the site, call in bomb scares, or set off charges and explosives in non-populated areas in order to dramatically impinge upon and even devastate the economic, the tourist industry of a particular country. So we're seeing that, so that this issue again, to recap, of whether whether insurgents are terrorists or freedom fighters, I said at the beginning the answer is both, and it's both because I know very few guerrilla organizations or insurgency groups that don't use terrorism. If they don't use it towards their enemies, we very often find internal terrorism. So although I've got really high scores for East Timor and Eritrea, we also have documented instances of internal terrorism against collaborators, dissidents, local civilians, and so forth. So again, the takeaway here would be that we have to, like we have to do with regard to just cause, legitimate authority, we have to evaluate each case on its own merits, each group on its own merits. Some groups earn the right, earn the right to fight, and they earn the right to fight because they satisfy both some of the conditions of jus ad bellum. They continue to maintain the right to fight because they adhere to the rules of in bello, the in bello conduct of war. We're going to see, when we look at terrorism, I think a need for a certain understanding about what is exactly a terrorist act, what is a non-terrorist act, how far groups can go, how far states can go in attacking civilians, all assuming these meet the conditions of effectiveness and utility and a general attention to human rights. So when you make these stipulations for guerrilla groups, I mean, it's nice for us to talk about this and to say what guerrilla groups should do. The final question is, who cares? Do guerrilla groups really care about this? Does the international community really think that we can impose jus in bello rules on guerrilla organizations? And the answer, and I'll just show you in the last slide, is I think we can. What you're seeing here is a cover of a publication by the International Committee of the Red Cross. I can't see it from where I'm at, called Exploring Criterion Conditions for Engaging Armed Non-State Actors to Respect Humanitarian Law and Human Rights Law. And these are some of the articles that appear in the journal. The ICRC has been conducting a program for the last 10 or 12 years to find ways to adapt, modify, discount international humanitarian law to make it easier in some cases for armed groups to conform without thoroughly undermining the essence of international humanitarian law. It's a difficult task, but they want to bring them a little bit closer, or as close as they possibly can, to some level of conformity so that they can continue to adhere to international law, and states can't come along and say, well, they're egregiously violating international law and therefore do not deserve status as combatants but are merely criminals. So there is a concern on the part of the international community to help mitigate the horrors of war and casualties in war by inducing non-states and armed groups to adopt these. But the armed groups themselves, especially those that are pursuing nationalist agendas who hope at one point to join the international community, are themselves also undertaking to conform to certain degrees with international humanitarian law. We saw how the PLO back in the 80s officially accepted the Geneva Conventions. Other groups accept certain portions of the Geneva Conventions. The Eritreans, when they fought against Ethiopia, were very strict about the prisoner of war regimes and about how they held prisoners and how they repatriated Ethiopian prisoners, how they cared for them. Because ultimately these groups do want to enter the community of nations. We saw how the IRA in the 1990s generally switched its strategy from one of civilian-oriented terrorism then to kind of a business, economic terrorism, and then they gave it up altogether and began to work their way towards peace. We see in Hamas, for example, since taking power in 2006, the incidence of terrorism has come down sharply. Part of that might be to Israeli counterinsurgency efforts, Part of it might be to the fact that Hamas became a legitimate government in its own territory and began to behave more like what we would expect from a legitimate government. So we're seeing concern on the part of the international community. We're seeing concern on the part of some, not all, insurgency groups to adopt and respect international humanitarian law. It's still a work in progress. And finally, the issue is important in the context of humanitarian intervention. We have to know these things about who are the belligerents that warrant war rights, that warrant status as belligerents, and who are belligerents that are criminals as we consider humanitarian intervention. I'm not going to talk any further about that. I think it's a topic of one of the talks later today or tomorrow. And with that, I conclude. Thank you.
So we have more than 10 minutes for Q&A, so I'll do the calling. Alan?
I have comments for both Valarie and Michael. With respect to the sort of conservative order as a primary importance argument, it seems to me there are two qualifications you need to make. First of all, in some tyrannies, there are particular groups that are treated so badly that anarchy may be preferable from their standpoint. We think about the Jews under Nazi control. Second, there's a standard response of revolutionaries to this conservative order matters first argument, and that is to develop parallel institutions or shadow governments prior to the overthrow of the regime. Vietcong spent a lot of energy doing this in the countryside, and also because of our Albanians did it in the run-up to the 1999 intervention. So that's a way of mitigating the worry that if you overthrow the regime, you have total anarchy and everybody's worse off. And I think that's a very important qualification for the argument you get. With respect to Michael, just a quick point. You emphasize legitimate authority. Now, the problem is that at least in early stages of revolution, it's almost impossible to achieve legitimate authority because the tyranny is blocking all of the standard processes that might result in a group becoming legitimate. They might become legitimate, you could argue, by developing adequate parallel institutions. It's just that that doesn't happen for a while. Sometimes it doesn't happen at all because the space control is so tight. So I'm worried about requiring legitimate authority as a condition for a group to have the rights of war. Because I think in the case where the just cause for revolution is greatest, it's almost impossible for a group to achieve legitimate authority, at least in the early stages of the revolution.
Okay. Are we going to take more than one question at a time, or just one at a time? Okay. So I think that those are really great points. On your second one, I think this idea of creating a shadow government is exactly the sort of thing that a responsible rebel group would have to do in order to address the concern of whether they would be creating order or creating disorder. So if they truly are interested in creating more just order, then that's something they would naturally have to do. And the failure to consider doing that is a sign both of a high likelihood that they won't be successful in creating order, but also perhaps that they aren't interested in order, right? Which I think some rebel groups are not necessarily interested in creating order. On your first point, I agree with you, except I would say maybe it's not that anarchy might be preferable, but that there are cases where a risk of temporary disorder, even a long-term disorder, might be better than nothing. And I think Aquinas agrees with this. So, you know, Aquinas' point was that sometimes disorder is caused by rebellion is worse than tyranny. But obviously some tyrannies could be worse, right, than the disorder. And in that case, it would be legitimate to fight. Although for a little more subtlety in your case, something to think about is, I think, insofar as resistance would be aimed against organs of the Nazi state, the problem is, even when those break down, especially in Eastern Europe, the killing is mostly done by locals, by everyday people and by partisans, right? And so in that case, it might not actually be possible to get more protection as a rebel without outside aid, which leads us back to the question sort of outside responsibility to deal with tyranny. So, you know, a political implication for us today coming from Calvin is that, you know, maybe you can't rescue yourself, but you have a very important rescue claim to make of the international community. if you're not in a condition to protect yourself. So I haven't fully thought that out, but I think that that's a really great point, which I want to explore more.
Thanks for the question. No, I absolutely agree with you. It's actually even worse than you described, because not only are some of the groups not yet fully legitimized, very often there's rival groups. And when you have rival groups, again, who's in charge and by what authority? Then there's a question of what constitutes legitimate authority. We tend to think of sometimes some sort of democratic process, when in most cases it's very, very often patrimonial and tribal authority. This is the messiness of insurgency warfare and insurgency ethics. States, for the most part, it's an all or nothing. Either they are or they aren't legitimate states. I mean, we have some borderline areas of rogue states, but generally you have a state that has legitimate authority. You don't have a state, there is no legitimate authority. So this problem is something that has to be viewed over a certain period of time. We also have to see if the organization can gain authority, if it can gain traction, if it can attract followers, if it can achieve success. We have the success condition. So the groups that I mentioned were all mature revolutionary or insurgency groups. You mentioned Kosovo, and you mentioned some others, and these were groups that have, over time, but I suppose if you were to go back to the very beginning and look at the genesis of these groups in Kosovo and South Sudan, in Eritrea and East Timor, then we see it's very messy, and we sometimes just have to sit back and watch and see how it plays out. This doesn't prevent necessarily humanitarian intervention. So you could have situations that Valarie talked about, where the situation is so bad the world community intervenes, not necessarily on behalf of an insurgency group, but just to either change the regime or to institute some sort of reform there. But I tend to agree, and it's something that changes from group to group, and it's something that we have to kind of view as an evolutionary process.
Pardon?
Okay, thank you. Thanks for a very provocative presentation. As a psychiatrist, thinking about some of the terms of moral behavior in terms of insurgency, I think about a dysfunctional family. And I think about what a person goes through in terms of rising up against dysfunctional parenting. When I hear your arguments, if I understand them correctly, they go, first of all, be clear of your outcome. Secondly, be clear of how you're going to do it. And thirdly, how much disruption is it going to cause? Now, if that's correct, then it seems to me that almost that buys in necessarily to accommodating to tyranny, unless you know that you can overcome it. And so I'm concerned about that argument, because if one buys those three principles, then we would have never gotten into World War II. You know, it seemed impossible to accomplish. So I'd like your thoughts about that, but there's a related concept, and that is that an insurgency, a rising up, is not necessarily a coherent entity. It doesn't have a group mind. It's more of a group movement, but without a group mind. And so I'm concerned about whether or not an insurgency can really qualify as having moral agency.
Those are really, really good questions. So if I start with the second question, I have to think. Oh, sorry. Those are really great questions. If I start with the second question, insofar as insurgents don't have a group mind, this poses obviously some problems for the examples in the classical tradition, which kind of imagine that rebels have a leader, that they have a plan. It's just, they don't say so explicitly, but the way they're described suggests that. I haven't really thought about that problem, but if I were to take a stab at it, I might say that in that case, maybe individuals are responsible for thinking about the use ad bellum considerations of their own individual participation, keeping in mind sort of judgments about how many other people may be participating, right? So in terms of thinking of likelihood of success and proportionality, a lot hinges on whether you think that you're alone in this, right? Are you one person fighting against injustice, or do you feel like this is a mass uprising? And yeah, and if there isn't any leadership at all, then one has to ask questions what the point of insurgency is. And this is something I've been really thinking about in the case, for example, of partisan resistance to the Soviets, or similar cases, which is that
depending on the nature of the tyranny, right, it may actually be better not to fight to accommodate the tyranny. More people may live. So if we're concerned about protecting civilians, which is my personal sort of motivation, protecting civilians, then in some cases, if the tyranny isn't targeting civilians qua civilians, right? So if it's not saying, I intend to wipe out all the people of this religious group or this ethnic group, right, or everyone who lives in this town, but if they're only using force against those who they see to be rising up against them for political reasons, then not rising up for political reasons would protect your fellow civilians, right? And so if you have no chance of winning, then how do you justify the risk you're posing to the civilian community in which you hide as an insurgent, right? So, okay, your first question though, are we accommodating tyranny in that case? Yes, maybe. But I think it's one thing for rebels to think about that. I think it's another thing for the international community to do it. So I'm going to unabashedly say I'm a bit of a statist. And so outside states have more capability than insurgents do in almost all cases. They're better organized, they have better militaries, they have stronger leadership, right? So they're more likely to be successful and should perhaps be the ones to fight against tyranny. Obviously, from a realist point of view politically, whether they'll do that, that's messy and complicated, and I don't have good answers.
Just a brief comment. I think we have to be careful about viewing insurgents as a single monolithic concept. There are those that fight against tyranny, but many of them are fighting for national self-determination, and they're not necessarily fighting against tyrannical regimes. The French in Algeria were not a tyrannical regime. The British, the Israelis are not tyrannical regimes. So those are substantially different from other groups that are in fact trying to overthrow the tyrannical regime, say the civil war in Syria. With regard to the personality, whether it's a person there or not, here too it depends. So if you've got a people fighting for national self-determination, I think you have an agent there. You have a tradition, you have a language, you have institutions very often. Then you have these parallel institutions that they sometimes build. You have leadership. So in many cases, you have an agent, a moral agent there in the same way a state, very similar to the way a state is. ISIS, less so. Anarchists, probably even less so. So again, it depends on what kind of groups you're talking about. But it's a question that you might want to just test across different kinds of groups.
Unfortunately, we're at our time limit, so we'll stop. But you can see that the questions are starting to mount. I personally think, and I think you probably both agree, that the standard criteria at Bellum, in Bello criteria apply to anti-regime and secessionary wars, but there are important nuances, and I think we need to explore these more. So thank you for helping us start this exploration.
Okay.
And the next talk, Jack Goldstone will give us some empirical data about how successful revolutions are and what kind of proportionality issues emerge. So we'll get some political science, empirical data on what happens in the real world. So, but thank you both for starting this great conversation.
Great.